Welcome to the Decipher podcast. My name is Dennis Fisher. I'm the editor in chief of Decipher, and with me today is my friend Matt Johansen, who you may know from the internet. And Matt works at Reddit right now, but he's had a whole bunch of different jobs over the years. We've known each other for a long time. Matt, looks like you're on the set of Between Two Ferns today. Is Zach Galifianakis off camera? Can he come on? What's happening?
Yeah, I used to have the bigger beard. I would have pulled off a pretty good Zach Galifianakis impression back then. But
You
uh,
would have. It's true.
but yes, it's trimmed down. I've lost some weight. I've trimmed the beard, so I'm not as good of a Zach. But yeah,
Back in the WhiteHat days, it would have been good, except
boom.
you didn't have the gray, which
Yeah, as we all.
yeah. Oh, I do. You just can't see it. So Matt and I have been trying to get this coordinated for a long time. We've been friends for a long time, and ran into each other at RSA and hung out, which was awesome. Hadn't seen each other in person for 4 years, probably.
COVID,
Yep.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably about right. So went to a baseball game, had a great day, and said, "Hey, let's get on a podcast." So here we are.
Yeah, absolute highlight of my week. Just playing hooky at RSA the last day and grabbing $20 tickets to the Giants on a beautiful sunny day out there. And I what did we sit in our seats for all of half an inning? We just kind of wandered the park and had a great day. So
If that, I think we just went to see where they were, and we're like, "Nah, let's go stand in
whatever.
the outfield." Yeah, it
Yeah,
was pretty nice.
it
That
was
was
a
a good
great,
day.
way better than the Moscone Expo floor. Those suckers while we were out there eating garlic fries. So
I do remember somewhere in about the third inning, you were like, "I wonder what those suckers at Moscone are
I,
doing
s-
in the
I think
outfield."
I tweeted a picture like whoever's not here is doing it wrong.
Yeah, we had a great day. So that's one of the things that Matt and I bonded over like early on was baseball. We're both big Yankees fans. We'll talk about that later, and not to alienate half of our audience right away. Let's
Everyone
let's
from Boston just signed off.
That's fine. I don't want them. I live in Massachusetts. I don't want those people. Um, let's Matt, let's start. Like, I think when I met you, you were probably at White Hat. You must have been. Was that your
Yeah.
first like? I knew you had jobs before that, but that was probably your first like public security job, right?
Yeah, so I started kind of out of college. I had like a few pretty low level jobs, but I graduated college when the economy was not doing too hot. So I kind of bounced around and did some contract like pen test gigs, and then yeah, White Hat was like a good place for me to land. Moved me out to California. Really focused me on AppSec when I saw a lot of the network pen testing stuff starting to get commoditized, right? Things like Nessus and Rapid7 were blowing up, and
Yeah.
Metasploit was like kind of brand new. Um, and I said, okay, hey, I see this becoming easier and easier for people to get into. So I really wanted to focus on AppSec. So White Hat was kind of a dream opportunity for me. And yeah, I was doing a lot of hands-on web app research there. I wound up finding a few bugs that got me a few Black Hat DEF CON talks like early in my career there. So yeah, that was kind of like my launch into the public. I was doing a bit of blogging and stuff. I don't know if you remember the Liquid Matrix days. I was on their podcast and stuff, but before we even had a podcast, I was the security intern. The mask of the security intern handle was me. So I would do a lot of back in Google Reader days. I was doing a lot of like news aggregation under the alias security intern for Liquid
Yeah.
Matrix. So I was somewhat public under the Liquid Matrix brand. But then yeah, White Hat. I wound up building out. They moved me to Texas. That's what ended me up here in Texas. I was in Houston. Built out their research center to about, I don't know, 65 ish people before. Yeah, I had one more role there where it was very public facing. That was like my whole job. We had a podcast called HackerCast with Jeremiah Grossman and Snake, Robert Hansen.
Yeah.
Um, and the three of us were just kind of the public facing brand of White Hat towards the end of all three of our tenures there. We all left in the same summer, I believe, to pursue other things. But yeah, White Hat was a good time. Since we hired so many researchers, very like entry level, we had like a pretty good system of like hiring young people out of college or not maybe not young, but just like less experience.
Hmm.
And we had a really good training program. So there's actually a lot of alumni of WhiteHat that are in like pretty cool spots now, doing like really big things that kind of went through that whole early research program. So it's fun to look back on, however many years later, a dozen years later, say, hey, I hired and trained that guy in Houston, and now he's VP of whatever at this place, and so it's pretty cool to see.
Yeah, it's funny. I think probably the first time I met you, it must have been at Black Hat at some point. I'm sure
Yeah,
our
Kylie.
snake.
I think we had a friend, some mutual friends in like the PR space, because our White Hat's PR people liked to put me in articles or on stage, and I know that was the world that you were playing in.
Yeah,
So I'm sure you quoted me in Threat Post or something like that, and we probably met at one of those events.
definitely. Yeah, I think we can chalk that up to Kylie. That sounds about right.
Yeah.
And I do remember at the time, I think me and our snake and Jeremiah are roughly the same age. I'm probably the oldest of that group, but we're in the same ish generation. And you're a few years younger than us. And I remember talking to our snake, and I was like, "Oh man, where'd you guys find this guy?" He's like, "I don't know. He's a child. He's so young, and he's doing
This
awesome
young pup.
stuff.
Yeah.
He's doing awesome stuff." I was like, "Well, we need a new generation. Let's get it going."
Yeah, I can't play the young pup card as much anymore. Some
I
of
feel you.
some of you guys who have known me since then still kind of see me as such, but it's like, man, I got my own little kid running around the house now, and we already talked about the gray beard, and my hairline's taking a dive, but here I am. I'm still hanging out with the same chuckleheads like you
Yeah, I
guys.
mean, that's the best part though, is like, I mentioned we hadn't seen each other in a long time, but saw each other at RSA and a bunch of our other friends, and it's just kind of like, you fall right back in. Like these are my people. Like, you know,
Yep.
we all share this common experience, and we all have the same friends. We all just sort of like, just click, and
Yeah.
it's super easy and very very comfortable.
Yeah, it's why a lot of us take a lot of the changes on Twitter so personally, is because we were able to build such a, core group of friends in the industry that we see a few times a year, but we kind of talk every day. I talk to Twitter friends more than I talk to like my college fraternity brothers or something like that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I have a few group threads with like close college friends, but really, I mean, I sit on Twitter and talk to you all more than I talk to most of those folks. So it's hard to, you know, see any threat to that platform and not take it seriously. So it seems to have stabilized a little bit, and people are kind of coming back, that if they hopped off to Mastodon or something, they realized how awful that is, and they're starting to
It's
come
not the
back.
same.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
It is kind of funny to hear you say that, Matt, because if you think about like 2009, 10, whenever like this security twits thing
Yeah.
started with, our friend Jen Leggio and
Mm-hmm.
Chris Hoff and the people that sort of like gathered all those folks together when Twitter was literally like, I don't know, say there was 50,000 people, but we all, say there was 200 security people, we all would just talk to each other
Yep.
all the time. And we see each other at Source Boston or Black Hat or
Yep.
RSA or DEF CON or whatever it happened to be, TorCon, Sector, or whatever. And that's where I met most of those people on
Mm-hmm.
Twitter long before I knew them in person. Especially people on the West Coast or New York City that I would never see in person. But you'd see them at a conference and they'd be like, "Oh, I'm this person on Twitter." You're like, "Oh shit, okay, cool."
Yep.
It's hard to explain now, but it was a real thing.
Yeah.
Like 12 or 13 years ago.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, you mentioned Jen. There was, we were doing, Twitter was weird back then too, because threading was different. So there wasn't
Oh
like this whole like reply chain, and like to
no,
retweet someone, you had to like tweet your own thing with the letters RT in front of it, and then like just copy and paste the tweet. Like all the functionality was so different, and so it was the way I described it to people, because like a lot of like my friends in real life didn't get it, and I was sitting in my dorm room interjecting into conversations between like Allison Miller, Chris Hoff, Alex Hutton, and they were like head honchos at like PayPal or Juniper at the time, or Cisco, wherever Chris was, and Alex was running the DBIR at Verizon. And I'm sitting in my dorm room just literally asking these people questions, right? And they're answering me. And then fast forward, 15 years later, Allison Miller was the CISO of Reddit and hired me here, right? And so like I can draw a line. I mean, Chris Hoff hired me at Bank of America for my last gig. Like to my very first early Twitter conversations in 2007, those same people have hired me at multiple jobs. I've worked for James Arlen, ran Liquid Matrix. He invited me to do Liquid Matrix.
Yeah.
He's hired me before, right? So I've really built not only like long lasting personal friendships, but a career out of those early friendships. I met Jen Leggio. She organized a hockey tweet up. Tweet ups used to be a thing because there was so like few people on Twitter. Now it's happening on Blue Sky. I'm on Blue Sky and people are like, Blue
Yeah.
Sky meetup. I'm like, oh man, this is exactly what happened on Twitter early days. It's like, oh, we got a few people. Let's go meet at a bar. And she was a big hockey fan back then. And
Yes.
like she did a hockey tweet up and I was like, I'm going just to introduce myself to this, security twits person, even though that was not the meetup. And like she still tells that story. We're still friends. So yeah.
It's really funny because that was one of the things that when we launched Threat Post, I think in 2009 or 10, I can't recall. I want to say 2010. Me and Ryan Narine, we sponsored like tweet ups in
Mm-hmm.
Cambridge
Mm-hmm.
or Boston on like a Wednesday night when there was like these I guess they probably still happen. There was like the Boston security meetup or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. They were CitySec meetups. And so
Yes.
so yeah, there was NISEC, BASEC was in San
Yep.
Francisco,
There was Boss or
ChiSec, and then
whatever.
yours was either BossSec or BeanSec. BeanSec,
Beansec.
wasn't?
That's
Yeah.
right. Yes.
Yeah.
Hoff would kill me. It was
Yeah.
like Hoff,
Zach
Wysoko.
Lanier.
Yeah, Zach Lanier was a big part of it. A
Yeah.
whole bunch of those original Boston people would be there,
Jack
and we would.
Daniel.
Yep. And we would
Yeah.
just pay the bar tab, which would turn out to be, $400 or something. And, just hang out with our friends in Cambridge
Mm-hmm.
at a bar in the afternoon on a Friday. It was great. And that's how I got to know, a lot of those people. And like, I don't feel like that. I know that NISEC still happens. I think BeanSec maybe still does, but
A lot of them died
um,
out. I started the HUSEC one, and it died out after I moved out of Houston.
okay.
Me and a friend here in Austin have kind of mumbled recently, like, "Hey, maybe we should start a meetup.com thing again in Austin because there's a few security people here." So yeah,
There's a
we've
ton.
we've talked
Yeah.
about it. Yeah.
And there's still a ton here in Boston, but also everybody's old and has kids
Yeah,
and
it's different.
it's
Security feels a little different because it exploded, right? So
yeah.
back then it was like a few weirdos, right?
Yes.
And
Now it's
nowadays
more
you go
religion.
to Vegas and you go to DEF CON and it's the size like it's in the old venue that Black Hat was in, and it's even bigger than that. And you go to
Yeah.
Black Hat and it feels like a different world compared to 15 years ago. I mean, I remember Source Boston was like what, a few hundred people. Like,
Oh,
I mean, and now we're
tops.
talking.
Yeah.
How many people were at RSA? 40,000? I don't know, something
Easily.
crazy. Yeah,
Yeah. Way
it's a
too many.
different vibe, you know.
It is. Yeah, it's true. I mean that first Source Boston, that was put on by, Dill Dog and Stacey Thayer and
Hmm.
Leggio and that whole group was so I think that was honestly like a seminal thing, even though it
It
was
was,
like,
yeah.
it wasn't in the 1990s, it was 2008, I want to say, or maybe
Still,
9.
still,
It
yeah.
it was that's a long time ago. It's 15 years ago. And
And it was a
but
smaller industry.
yeah, it's true.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I have a lot of love for Source.
Me too.
They got me to Ireland for the first time. I spoke at Source Dublin, and maybe one of the first or second Source Dublin. I got flown out there for that. Always a good memory.
I tried so hard to scam my way into
I
a trip to that, but
did. Brought my
it just
wife out. We drove around Ireland. Yeah, it was cool.
it's a cool place.
Hmm.
I love it. Yeah. So you mentioned you were sort of like injecting yourself into these Twitter conversations when you're sitting in your fraternity house or dorm room or whatever. Um, were you planning to be a security guy, or did you just want to, like, I don't know, I like
Yeah.
computers and I'll figure it out?
Yeah, I was a comp sci guy. I knew I liked computers. I always like built my own computers and stuff like that. And when I was growing up in middle school and things, had supportive family on that. I had one or two uncles that were super into tinkering like that, so they would always help me. My dad was kind of into it enough to help me, assemble a motherboard or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, and so I was always into the technical stuff. And then I actually had an uncle who worked at my. I've got a big Irish Catholic New York family, so tons of aunts and uncles. So I had an uncle who worked security at the UN, like physical security. Like he's got cool pictures with him in the earpiece, like standing behind the Pope and
Oh,
stuff like
damn.
this, right?
That's
And
funny.
he would, I guess he was friends with the IT like staff people, and he's like, hey, I got this nephew looking to do XYZ, what should he specialize in? And he asked like the UN people, and they said security. Everyone's going to need a security person in the next couple of years. And I don't know, I've never got that person's name, but that earworm like it set me on this trajectory for sure, like from high school on. um yeah, in high school we offered computer programming for like half a semester, and somehow I talked my guidance counselor into letting me take it as an independent study all 4 years. So I literally always had a computer programming class all 4 years of high school. So that definitely set me apart when I went into comp sci in college. I knew a fair bit of I mean, basic at the
Yeah.
time, and which was useless. But at least you start to like learn the lingo, right? Oh, I know what an if else statement is. I know, whatever. A little bit easier going into college, and then in college, I really lucked out. My last year, I still talk to him too. My college hired a information security, like hired a CISO who happened to have a PhD, so they also became an adjunct professor. And so the very first time my college offered a security course, like as like a senior seminar, super specific senior seminar, was my like last semester. And that was the first time they offered it, and I hopped all over it. I was like, yes, I can't believe, like, I'd already introduced myself to the guy because I was like, hey, this is like the career I'm interested in,
Mhm.
cool to meet you that you got hired here. And it was like he was a SANS instructor too, so it was basically like a SANS class in college, like my last semester, right? Like I was writing buffer overflows, we were doing capture the flags, we were doing like legit stuff. It wasn't just like some 101 uh course on like what is infosec or anything like that.
Here's how passwords work.
Exactly, it wasn't that. It was like legit, and I wound up getting like GCIH certified right after because of it. I basically learned a bunch of the stuff for the SANS course. I still keep in touch with him. Case Loon. Yeah, he's still there. He's still a professor there. He ran the CERT program for the Netherlands before
Okay.
moving here. Yeah, yeah. So he's super
Okay.
legit. And another cool story, he got to introduce me on my very first Black Hat talk. He's a volunteer at Black Hat, and so he like was a speaker proctor and like got to stand on stage and introduce me and be like, "Hey, I taught this guy in college a few years ago, and here he is." So that was like a cool
That's
tie-in.
wild.
So yeah, that set me forward. And then it was just like I said, I graduated. The economy sucked. I couldn't get in, so I was just talking to all these people on Twitter. I like rubbed like whatever pennies together I could, and I got down to ShmooCon right after I graduated college. It was the closest to. I was on Long Island. It was the closest that I could get to like try to meet some people to see if someone would hire me, and it worked. But I wrote Jack Daniel on Twitter because he was in Boston and he rented an RV for the first time and said, "Hey, I'm gonna drive a bunch of people down to ShmooCon, whoever can fit." I said, "Hey, are you taking I-95? If I can get to I-95, will you pull over and pick me up?" And he said, "Yeah." And so they literally like I took the Long Island Railroad to Penn, hopped over to Hoboken on the path, went upstairs. It was a truck stop, and there's an RV. I was like living with my parents right after college because yeah, broke college kid, the economy sucked, moved home, and I was like, "Mom, I met this guy named Jack Daniel on the internet. He's going to pick me up in his RV, and we're going to go down to DC." You can imagine that conversation. And I got in the RV. It was like Chris Hoff, Zach Lanier, all those guys you just talked about were in the RV, and that's who I got to like sit and chat with for 5 hours on the way
Yeah.
down to DC, and that's who I walked into ShmooCon with. So it was way better than just like some idiot college kid from Twitter. I got to like walk in and get introduced to a few people because I was on the Shmoo bus, and that was like a cool story that year.
Yep.
And that's it. I met James Arlen and Dave Lewis for Liquid Matrix. They wound up hiring me for some gigs. I did the same thing in Vegas. I rubbed whatever pennies together I could to go in Vegas. I stayed way off strip for dirt cheap, which was a giant mistake because
Oh, damn. No, no, no,
I was
no.
like walking in the 119-degree heat to like try to get to I think it was the Riv DEF CON was at. I don't even know where,
Probably.
Alexis Park or the Riv. And
It would. I think that was probably after Alexis
it was
Park.
probably after Alexis. And yeah, I went to Casa Fuente the first day in Vegas, and again, all these people. Allison Miller was sitting there, Alex Hutton was sitting there, Dave Mortman was sitting there. All these people that I've since worked with or have hired me. I
Yep.
was like, yeah, let me buy you a cigar. I had no money. I was like, but yeah, let me try to like just interject. I have no business being here. Thank you for letting me be here. Can I buy you a drink? I was like, I know nothing. I know nobody. I met you all on Twitter. Thanks for letting me hang out. And so that's what I recommend to people getting in now too. I said, just like interject yourself into these conversations. It's a much bigger world now than it was then. So it's even easier to like just
Yeah.
figure out who's who on Twitter and just start talking to them. There's even more local meetups, and local B-sides didn't exist. There's B-sides in every city on the planet now. That didn't exist. I had to go to ShmooCon because I was the only
Yep.
thing on the East Coast at the time, right? So, um, long-winded answer, but yeah, that's kind of my first couple jobs in infosec came out of just getting myself to those conference and just like meeting those people. Trust is really built like that, right? Like
Yeah.
face to face. And then yeah, someone was like, "Yeah, I'll hire you to go do pen tests or whatever." And okay, cool, thanks. You paid like they paid my student loans for a few years, and then I finally RSA. I met Jeremiah out at WhiteHat, and he was like, "Hey, come. Are you still in town? Come interview." I, I met some of their guys over tacos the day after RSA. I stayed in town. I changed my flight so I could stay in town, and I went and interviewed at WhiteHat, and that's it. Rest is history there.
It's pretty great. I mean,
Yeah.
the shmoo bus thing is so funny because Jack Daniels, a good friend of mine, he when he lived up here, he lived like I don't know, 15 minutes from me, and I was supposed to be on that RV trip, and I would have met you, and I can't remember why I couldn't go. I think one of my kids got sick or something like that, and I couldn't go. I ended
Yeah,
up
Bill
flying.
Bill Brenner was in there. Yeah, and
Right.
Space Rogue was in there. So we had some journalists.
I think that was when I was at Tech Target. I think Bill Brenner and I were working together at
Yeah,
the
yeah,
time.
sounds familiar.
So I can't remember why I didn't go, but I didn't go. But all those people are the people like Jack Daniel. Like I don't think it gets said enough in the community. Like what an effect Jack had,
Hmm.
not just in the Boston. Like you mentioned B sides. That's Jack Daniel.
Yeah.
Like him and a bunch of other people. But that I was at the first one in Vegas, which I think was the first one. Or San
Hmm.
Francisco might have been the first one. I don't recall.
No, the first one was in Vegas. Was a house in
Okay,
Vegas. San
that's
Francisco was
right.
like the first offshoot. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Because it was originally a bunch of people that didn't get into Black Hat or DEF
Yep,
CON
yep.
talks.
Just like
And then
rented Airbnb. If I don't even know if Airbnb existed,
no,
rented a
it was
house.
just a
Yeah,
house. Yes.
yeah,
And then at the next one, I remember Jack somehow strong armed me into doing a speed debate with HD Moore.
yeah. I
And
remember HD was in the early ones. Yeah.
it was absurd because for people that don't know, first of all, HD is the smartest person on the planet,
Yes.
and he speaks at 1,000 miles an hour.
Yeah.
So a speed debate with HD, like I think I said four things, and then I was like, Jack, I'm gonna go to the pool. Like this is stupid. What am I doing here? It's a complete waste of my time and everybody else's. I'll be in the lazy river,
Yeah.
like just going around.
Yeah.
But yeah, it those kind of like sort of serendipitous things that you mentioned matter. Like people, I'm sure 100 people have asked you like, how do you get into infosec? Like how do I do what you
Hmm.
do, that kind of thing? And you're just like, there's not a great answer to that, like depending on what your specialty is. But what you just described is sort of the classic, like, well, I met this person, then I met this person, and they introduced me to this person, and now I'm here.
I
And
have not
sort of
gotten a job via applying for a job in since I was an intern.
yeah,
Like I have not just like randomly applied for a job and that's like how that worked out. Like literally since an internship, every job that I've had over the last 15 years has been either someone I met at a security conference or introduced like via another friend, right?
yeah,
So yeah, I think it's so much more powerful, right? I mean, obviously, step
yes.
one, don't suck, right? Like, be
Don't be an
hireable,
asshole.
right? Well, yeah, don't be an asshole, and like, go learn some stuff, go do some stuff, right? Work on. I think I was working on an OWASP project, and I was, like, I was volunteering for, like, to write infosec policies for nonprofits. I was doing a whole bunch of stuff so that when I was like sitting at that table that I had no business being at in
Yeah,
Vegas, I still had something to talk about, right? Like, hey, I back in the day, it was like really hot. There was no like containers or anything like, and VMware was like kind of new. And so there was like all these like purposely vulnerable web apps like to learn web app pen testing, but they were really hard to like get running if you weren't like a sysadmin. And I wasn't, right? I kind of went right into security. I kind of skipped that whole sysadmin phase. And so I was like, man, it's taking me hours to like get these vulnerable web apps running. Why don't I just like package these up as like a VM that people can download and then like just fire up the VM and then they've got 3 vulnerable websites to like practice on. And that was an OWASP project like that I did, right? And so just stuff like that. And like, or like I released an open source tool that like parsed snort logs for IP addresses, like just like little things that like you're able to talk about when you have no other experience to talk about. You got to get
Yeah.
some experience somehow, right? And then interject yourself in those conversations. Or, I mean, not and then you can find cool projects by interjecting yourself in these conversations as well, right? Um, and just like have stuff to talk about, right? I think I mentioned Alex at like the DBIR. I'm like
Yeah.
super involved with that every year, right? I like won some contest that they put out in the DBIR. Like I read it all the time. I write summaries of it. You know,
Was that the I don't know if they still do that.
the
They used
cover
to have,
contest, I won it.
yeah.
I won a telescope. It's sitting upstairs. Yeah, yeah, I won it. It was cool.
I remember that it might have been the first DBIR, maybe the second, I don't recall. I was in DC when Hutton still worked was still working on it, and we had a press briefing at like a hotel bar somewhere at like the JW Marriott or somewhere in downtown DC, and the the PR person was there and was like, very like, probably 22 years old, like half an hour out of college, and was like, let me introduce you to Alex Hutton. And like, Alex and I just played it off like as if we had never met each other and we're like very formal. And
Yes,
then like 5 minutes into it, he was like, you can leave. Like Dennis and I are just going to talk. Like
yes,
we got
yes.
this. Like
Nice.
those early, like the DBIR also, I feel like it's obviously very important, but I don't think people understand like how groundbreaking that was when it
Yeah,
came out.
it's
Like
huge.
nobody was collecting data like
No,
that at
yeah.
all.
I
It
mean,
was
it's
all
spun off into like now Wade and Jay are doing
right.
basically that as a service, right? Like, hey, you got a bunch of data, like I'll tell a good
Spill,
story out of it, you
yeah,
know, with
spill the tea too.
Scientia,
Yeah.
right there. And they ran the DBI, they both ran the DBIR at some point, right? After Alex. And so, yeah, I mean, it's kind of like WhiteHat. Like a lot of people that have worked on that have gone on to do like crazy good things.
Mhm.
CISO of Chris Porter, CISO of Fannie Mae, was on the DBIR team. Like, I mean, it's one of those roles that you get exposure to so much that like you can go on to do a lot of really cool stuff with it. So
That I feel like that's another sort of not underrated, but maybe undervalued piece of what this industry is, or the community, maybe not the industry, the community itself, which are those are two different things for people that don't know. The security industry, security community, not the same thing. Um, it's those sort of, not just like, hey, we've got this job open, would you like to talk about it. It's more like, hey, we're doing this cool thing with all this data, would you guys be interested in talking about that? Maybe we can tell a story for you guys about like your user data or your customer data or whatever it is. And those kind of cool ideas, obviously, like you said, turn into a awesome business for Wade and Jay and other people. Now everybody does that kind of stuff. I If I open up my laptop right now, I'd have 30 data reports, like pitches.
yeah,
We compiled all this data from 100,000 customers. Here's the
yeah.
thing. Like that's
White Hat did it back in the day too, and White Hat and the DBIR were some of the only ones really doing it, and both would get a lot of criticism because like the sources of the data were kind of small, right? Like
yes,
in
yeah,
comparison to the whole world. So trying to like trend of like, oh, well, this is what the attackers are doing, or this is what kind of website vulnerabilities are out there, when you're really looking at a pretty small slice. But at least we were looking at any slice, right? And the
hmm
DBIR has grown. So I think it is actually a pretty legitimate slice of incidents nowadays, right? It was fairly
for
small
sure.
early on, but they developed a whole framework called Varus to share that information so that there's like a standardization of like, hey, how can we make sense of all these data breaches that happen every year? It's still, I mean, it's still one of my favorite reads every time it comes out. This year, no exception.
Yeah,
I just talked about it on my podcast last week. Just like went through it because it's always just so interesting.
it is. Yeah, I remember when they first started getting external data sources into that, they'd be, every year there'd be two or three more. We've got AT&T, we've got this company, we've got this company, we've got, some FBI data. That was the big one, I think, when they got FBI
Mm-hmm.
data. You're like, oh
Mm-hmm.
shit, okay, now we're, it was the IC3 or whatever it's called. We've got
Mm-hmm.
their data. And then you started seeing the government reference the DBIR, and you're like, oh, okay, now we know. Like, this
Mm-hmm.
is legit. Like, and it's still, I think, probably the gold standard for any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
it's awesome. Yeah, I was just talking about it. It was like, they talk about how most incidents are still financially motivated, so that's like
yeah.
the kind of the driving force. They talked about kind of cut through a lot of the headlines around Log4j, and they were like, what was the actual incident and data loss impact of Log4j? It was really interesting. Um, it's always interesting to see what ransomware is up to, because it's like always top of mind, but it seems like it's plateauing based on the data, which is super fascinating. Like EDR
Mhm.
might be catching up. It's not getting better, but it's plateauing. It's like, well, okay, why? What kind of stories could we tell from all of this? How's the industry doing? Right. Yeah, super fascinating.
Yeah. So Matt, we mentioned at the beginning that you work at Reddit now. You're running security there. What are the things that you mentioned ransomware. What are the things that you're sort of concerned with on a daily basis aside from that? I'm sure there's a whole spectrum of things. It's not just one or two things, but if you wake up every morning, you're like, all right, here are the, four or five things that I've got to deal with today.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no concerns at Reddit right now. Super easy, casual day job. Tongue in cheek if you're listening to this in the future. But yeah, I think we had a phishing incident this year. We talked about it publicly.
Mm-hmm.
So and that always continues to be like of concern, just the human element, right, of things. No matter how many technical controls you have in place, the human element is always there, right? Whether it's social engineering or phishing, it's just ever present, right? So I talk a lot. I have a few Twitter threads, and I've actually like made like a document of like how to become unfishable that I'm like getting ready to uh, publish. But I mean, super quick and easy is just like use things that aren't like SMS based tokens or hard tokens, right? Like YubiKeys is kind of the big one that we all cheerlead.
Yeah.
Passkeys are getting more popular, which is really cool. It's
Mm-hmm.
like tying your auth to a hardware device that can't be fit, like that you couldn't give to someone over the phone if they were convincing you, like, hey, give me your 6-digit code. This is your IT department, like, or hey, I'm about to send you a URL. Type in your MFA code. Like, you
Mm-hmm.
can't do that with a YubiKey or a passkey, right? They are unfishable in that way, right? So those kinds of things obviously super prevalent. um, the big one that's like really interesting to me right now, and um, I've been asking around for more data around this, because I've even given a lot of talks on Kubernetes security, right? I was running security for a startup here in Austin that was built on Kubernetes back when it was in beta, and there was like no security research around it. GCP was even pretty, like, Google Cloud was like pretty new, especially compared to AWS. So like their version of CloudTrail, like AWS CloudTrail on Google, was like Google Cloud logging, and it was also kind of not really working like in a prod way. So I was like really early on a lot of these things, and so I've talked about it a lot publicly, and so it's been a major focus of mine, like container and Kubernetes security and cloud security. Um, and I'm trying to see again, like, look, going back to like the data and the DBAR, like incidents, security incidents that involved like a Kubernetes problem, and there just like
Okay.
isn't as many as you would think, based on like how much, like how wide of an adoption Kubernetes has had, and it's had like a number of security CVEs published and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And like we're not seeing the public like breaches being involved a whole lot, outside of like the low hanging fruit, like crypto miners, like, oh, someone
Sure.
found some open thing and like started mining crypto, right? And that's like, maybe that's the tip of the spear of security incidents, because then maybe threat actors, can pull on some of the, see what some of the crypto miners are doing, and then do worse things than crypto miners. But that's like an interesting thing for me, because a lot of us are talking about cloud security, and I'm saying Kubernetes specifically. Cloud security, I'm sure there's tons of incidents, especially like with open S3 buckets. That's something that we always worry about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, things like that. But it like you want to focus your time as a security person with limited resources on like what's going to stop the most incidents and like reduce the risk of your org operating the most, right? And so yeah, I'm having a hard time like focusing on some stuff like that, even though I talk about it a lot publicly. So I'm like having like a weird conflict of personality there. It's super interesting. But yeah, going back to like the cloud stuff, another topic that I really like to focus on right now is like the paved roads to production that like Netflix has popularized, of like creating the default path for developers to be the most secure path, right? So they'll take it, right? If that's the way
Right.
to prod, it's the easiest path, it's the default path, and it's the most secure path, they will not need to like look for a way around it, right? Like developers won't all of a sudden have like a prod key on their laptop because it was easier to develop like this one thing that they were doing with that, because that introduces risk, right?
Sure.
um so these paved roads to production and then adding guardrails to those paved roads is like been a major focus of mine lately.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, the cloud part of it is really difficult because in a lot of cases you don't really control what the cloud platforms do. Like
Hmm.
you can control the way that you use them, but
Hmm.
on the back end, you're sort of at their mercy.
Hmm.
You know, what is GCP doing? What is AWS doing? What is Azure doing? Like you can't force them into security controls that you want, you
Yeah.
know? So, I mean, big customers can be like, we'd love to have you do this, but you don't have a ton of control over that.
Yeah, Bank of America did. We were able to affect the roadmap of some public clouds and get some offerings there. But yes, at most companies you don't. But you know, I'm like a huge proponent of using like cloud like public cloud services. I think that especially like things like email providers, like even going back to the DBIR, like some crazy percent of incidents, like 41% of incidents that involve data loss involved a mail server that like you ran yourself.
Yeah.
And I forget, it might have been HD Moore. Someone that we've talked about like on this podcast already used to say it all the time, which was you can't run a mail server better than Microsoft or Google can. Like no one
That was
can,
Jack.
like you can't. It was Jack. Yeah,
That's Jack.
it
Yeah.
was like you can't run that better than they can, right? And
Right.
I know that there's like, you know, you think that you're giving them your data, but it's like you just like you can't run it as securely. You can't stay as up to date with patches. Your configurations will be worse than Microsoft is. Same with Google, like you know, Gmail and Google, right? Like you trying to like run anything, like running your own mail server, I think is a dangerous game that a lot of people play because they think they're reducing risk by not using a cloud service, and it's like,
Right.
no, not really, right? I used to be friends with, I'm still friends with, they used to run security over at Slack, Ryan Huber. And I would talk to him about, hey, man, I wish we could use Slack at these big financial companies that I worked for over the number of years, but we can't because we can't send you our comms, like based on regulation. And he always said that. He goes, yeah, we don't do on-prem because you can't run Slack better than I can. Like is
Sure.
what he said. Like they didn't even offer on-prem because they were like, no, because you're gonna mess it up, and then we're gonna be to blame. And I was like, yeah, I get it. That actually makes a whole lot of sense. And so like
It does because it makes
competitors,
them look bad,
yeah,
even though like you guys are the one that screwed it up somehow. Yeah.
yeah. So like some guy at Goldman like wrote a Slack clone and like spun it out as his own company, and all the banks use that like because they can run it locally. It's called, you know, Mattermost, and every all the financials that I've worked for use it, and it's not as good at Slack.
No,
but
of course it's not.
but yeah, so I'm a big proponent of the cloud services because I think that especially like you know, AWS and Google, like they can run like that stuff better than I can. The stuff that they control, I'm glad they control it.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Gmail. That's the way I feel about that. Even from just a straight consumer side, like if you set up Gmail the right way, even if you don't have the advanced protection package or whatever, but if you have it set up, you know, with a hardware security key or even, you know, app-based 2FA and the other controls, you're in pretty good shape. You're a lot better off than some random email server that your buddy from college is running. Like
Yeah,
you're,
or
you know,
myself, right? Yeah, like I think I tried that when I first bought my
of
like
course you did.
mattj.com domain and like ran email. I think I was like, yeah, I'm not using Google for this, no way. And then I was like, oh, this is awful. So yeah,
Yeah. Also, why do you want to do more work?
no,
Let them do it.
gosh, yeah, it's
No one
not.
wants to do
I
that.
don't I don't wake up on Sundays wishing I could be a sysadmin right now. You know.
Absolutely not.
Let
No,
me
I
patch my
mean,
mail server over my morning coffee and hope nothing breaks.
right, but it's going to.
Hmm.
Um, Matt, you mentioned your podcast. You've got this newsletter that I think, yeah, I don't know, how long has it been? 3, 4 months since you started it?
Yeah, I think I'm on 16th edition, so every week. So I think
Okay.
tomorrow the 16th edition goes out. So still fairly new, but yeah, at it long enough to prove that I'm consistent at it.
Well, that's the important thing. I mean, we talked about this in San Francisco about how difficult writing is. And,
Hmm.
for me, podcasting is a little easier. You just talk into a microphone like this and you can
Hmm.
sort of just hit record and go. Writing takes some, sort of planning, and you have to know what you're doing. And there's also editing involved and that kind of shit. So, consistency, yes, that is the key to that. And I said it on Twitter right after your newsletter started. I think it's awesome. You're doing an excellent job, and it's not just because we're friends. I would have told you if it was bullshit, it wouldn't have been on the internet, but I would have told you. Um, but I think it's really well done because it's not just like, hey, here's a bunch of links that I saw this week that I think you guys should check out. These are cool. It's got a theme and it's got sort of an idea behind it every week of, here's what I'm thinking about this week. Here's some things along those lines. And, the overarching theme of making yourself vulnerable and your organization, because we all are, whether you want to admit it or not. That's why we both have jobs. I think it's great. I'm really proud of you. It sounds stupid to say, but I really enjoy it, and I hope you're enjoying doing it because
Yeah.
it's really well done.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for bringing it up. So yeah, if anyone listening isn't familiar, it's called Vulnerable You. And yeah, every week there are a number of types of newsletter, and I was like looking to get back into content creation. I went and worked for bank. I've mentioned it a few times already in this conversation. Worked for banks for a few years. They didn't like me doing anything publicly. So now
Yeah.
that I don't work for them anymore and I'm not in like a heavily regulated space, I was like, hey, I kind of want to get back into like podcasting and blogging because I used to be super into it at my WhiteHat days and at my startup and all this kind of stuff, conference talks, all these things that I had to stop doing when I worked for the big finances. And so I kind of popped my head out of the sand and said, "Oh, it looks like newsletters are having a moment right now instead of blogging." So that's kind of why I started it. And then I had a few other friends reach out that run their own security newsletters. Dan Miesler runs Unsupervised Learning, and Clint Gibler runs TLDR Sec. And they reach out and they said, "Hey, like, glad you're doing this. We're not really competing with each other. One of the best indicators of someone being a potential to sign up for my newsletter is, do they sign up for newsletters, right? Like, you're probably signed up for all of them or none of them, right? Do you
Yeah.
like never want something in your email, or do you like, are you cool with a few emails a
Give
week
me all
of
the
news
stuff.
stuff? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's a few types of newsletter out there, right? Like aggregators, kind of like what you mentioned, right? Hey, here's a whole bunch of links, like a curated list. And I think there is value in that, but I think that there are some already that do really good in that space.
Hmm.
And then there's like the, more of the expert slash commentary version of it, right? And I'm trying to kind of play in that space a little bit more of like, hey, I have got something to say about this. I'm going to add to to the topic of the week. I'm going to add something to it. And the Vulnerable You name came from, I don't know if you're familiar with Brene Brown.
Not.
Who is, I don't even know how to describe Brene, but she is like a public speaker. She's an author in this space, not security at all, but like more mental health, leadership, things like that. And she has a book called The Power of Vulnerability, and she's like called herself a vulnerability researcher. And I've heard that and go, wait, so am I. Right? Like, very different vulnerability researcher, but we both are, right? And so I kind of like had that crossover in mind.
Hmm.
And I've been very public online with like my mental health journey and like how important I think that is to to everyone to focus on. And
Hmm.
so that's kind of the blend that I try to bring to the topics that I write is like a personal vulnerability and security vulnerability stuff. So like, how can we adapt some of these like mental health topics and personal growth topics to what we do in infosec, right? So yeah, I think last week I talked about like rejection, getting rejected from talks that you submitted to conferences, a thing we've all gone through. I kind of explored that. I've explored, having a growth mindset, looking at obstacles that you hit, like be it an incident response or be it like, oh man, we got hacked this week and I have to respond to that. Like not looking at that as like a failure, but looking at that as a growth opportunity and how to explore
Mhm.
that. So those are the kinds of topics I touch on. And then I do a bit of news aggregation with some of my commentary as well, right? Just like, hey, yeah, it's in your inbox every week. Thanks for listening to me talk. Here's what I'm reading this week and what I think is cool. So that's the gist. And then, yeah, just this last week, I started the YouTube channel and the podcast version of that same content. So it's just basically me verbally talking about all the stuff that I talk about in the newsletter, if that's some people would rather consume that way. So yeah,
It's
that's me.
impressive,
Thanks.
man.
Yeah. Thank you for the shout out. Yeah. Vulnerable and then the letter U.
I love it, and you know, it's funny to me because like this is what I do. Like so like all I've ever done is writing. Like
Yeah.
it's pretty simple for me, but I like for folks that that's not their main thing. Like sitting down and writing, I know it takes you time. Like writing several hundred words or several thousand words in a newsletter every week, or planning out a podcast. In addition to your job and your family and all that kind
Mm-hmm.
of stuff, is not a simple thing, and it's not you know it shouldn't be taken lightly. And I think the contribution that you and the other folks you mentioned Clint Gibler, I love his newsletter, Daniels, they're all really good. And it's contributing to the collective knowledge of the community, which I think is what a lot of us love about this. It's not just like, hey, I'm better than you. It's like, hey, here's something I learned. Let me share it with you.
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot of that, and also I hope to push the kind of the boundary on conversation around personal exploration and like all the struggles that we deal with, right? Instead of just the highlights and the news and like I want to talk about some of the shared struggles we all deal with, and the more public we are with those struggles, the more everyone realizes that they're not alone with those, and like we can all get better at dealing with all that kind of stuff is the gist, right? So that's what I'm hoping to bring to the community. I've lost too many friends to mental health concerns, especially in this industry. I feel like we are prone to burnout and depression and anxiety, and we have stressful jobs. And yeah, over the last couple of years, just have lost too many people to it. So I hope that we can kind of keep shining a light on it and talk about it openly. So that's part of the goal there.
Well, I mean, that's obviously really important. You're right. I mean, some of those same people are my friends or were my
Yep.
friends too. It's really difficult, and I think in this community, you do hear a lot about sort of the burnout part of it, which is very very real. But there's a lot of other parts to it too, as you mentioned, Matt, like anxiety. I mean, a job that you have, like, how do you not wake up 5 times a night and be like, shit, did the servers fall over? Like, what's happening? Like that that's one type of anxiety, but also like, am I devoting too much time to my job and not enough to my family? Am I doing the right thing for our customers? Am I good enough at this? And you hear a lot about imposter syndrome in this community, which I think is probably a real thing, especially because there's a lot of folks in security that didn't study it. They were, sort of did it as a hobby and somehow it became their job. And they're like, should I really be here? Who cares? Like you're good at it. You're good, you're good enough. We know a lot of those people and they're all really, really great at their job. It doesn't matter if you went to Harvard or MIT or whatever. Are you good at your job? Yes, then you're fine. You're doing a good job. But those aren't the type of things that you think about at 3 in the morning when you wake up. You're just like, I don't know. I'm not good enough at this.
Yep.
You know? Yeah.
Well, and just talking about that is important because maybe some people don't realize that other people are waking up at 3 in the morning and
Yeah.
thinking that, right?
Yeah.
Unless other people are saying it, they might think, man, why is this stuff keeping me up at night? That's just adding to the pile of what they think about themselves and like what they need to get better at, right? It's like, hey, no, we're all there, like we're all
Yeah.
making it up as we go. And yeah, I mean, like I'm talking with we brought up Jen Leggio. Her and I have been talking a lot about doing a talk together on this topic because she's being very public with her sobriety journey right now and mental health journey and like all that kind of stuff. Being public with all that stuff is just nothing but beneficial to everyone reading it, right? Because it's just like you never know who's going to read that and go, oh hey, me too. And that just gets them like one day further down the road if they're going through something pretty hard, right? And so yeah, that's what I'm trying, right? Like I talk to so many, like I'm really into like startup founder. I'm very entrepreneurial by spirit, so I like to talk to like startup founders and stuff like that. Talk about a stressful job, right? You got,
Oh, yeah.
maybe you got a few dozen people's salaries that are based on you succeeding, right? Like and then there's like, there was this stigma when like, I know you said I'm a few years younger than you, but like when we were growing up in the 90s and stuff like that, you wouldn't talk about therapy. If someone was in therapy, that was like, oh, they're crazy. Like they're in a shrink. They're going to see whatever.
Uh-huh.
And like, I feel like we've broken down that a lot, but it's still, there's still like taboos associated with like, different. Oh, are you on medication? Like, oh, is there a taboo around talking about that you're on some sort of meds that like really help you get through the day? Or like, did you need to take some time off of work and like maybe, do what a mental health retreat or something? Like some
Mhm.
people just don't like talking about some of this stuff, right? Because they see it as a weakness. And that's one of the things I like to say on the vulnerable you is finding strength in weakness, right? Is like these things that are perceived weak, if you talk about them publicly, can actually appear strong because how brave it is to talk about something like this publicly, right? So, um, yeah, I really appreciate you bringing it up. It's just, more space to talk about this stuff, the better, in my opinion.
I completely agree. It's one of the things I try to get across to my kids who are both, college age now, is that literally nobody knows what they're doing in life. Everyone is making it up as they
Yeah.
go along. Like,
I keep waiting for the grown-ups. I'm like, I'm a dad. I'm like deep in my career, and I keep waiting to run into the grown-ups who are going to tell me what's going on.
right.
And there just are no grown-ups. We are the grown-ups.
Yes, that's exactly right, Matt. Like, my kids, like, I'm very lucky. A lot of my closest friends are still my friends from college. Like, my best friend in college is married to my older sister. It's like,
Right, right. Yep.
so my kids have grown up knowing a lot of my friends that I've known for 30 or 40 years. And they're like, oh, well, this guy started a company. This person's a lawyer. I'm like, sure. Let me tell you a story about that guy. Like, and they're
Let me
just
tell
like,
you about the
wait a
time I
second.
picked him off a curb. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Just like everyone's making it up as they
Yeah.
go along. It's
Yeah.
just, that's how life is. Nobody's got a plan.
Yep.
They're just kind of like, it looks like a plan in retrospect. Like they
Yep.
went from here to here to here. Like, okay. But like you mentioned with you haven't applied for a job in a long time. It That's perfect. You don't want to. You want
Right.
you want to
Yeah.
work with your friends.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just the other reason for me to just be more public now that I can, career wise, right?
Yeah.
Is just like bouncing off of people like you more often, right? It just brings opportunities. It brings me joy, right? To like keep in touch with people that I've known that are, continuing to be successful and all this kind of stuff. It's like one of the other topics I talked about recently on my feed was the loneliness epidemic, right?
Mm.
Is something the Surgeon General is talking about now. Another podcast I really like, the Prof G Show, Scott Galloway. He's written a few good books too, and he's talking about it a lot. And it kind of inspired me to realize, like, hey, infosec as an industry is kind of by default pretty lonely. Like you're not allowed to talk about a lot of the stuff that you do, right? It's fairly sensitive. And then just we're just paranoid people. A lot of us worked from home before COVID. That made
Mhm.
that cool. Like I know I did. A lot like infosec was a pretty remote work friendly career, right? So like you wind up with, I know a few like hackers that live in the mountains with coconut internet, right? Like and
So do I.
and like
Yep.
and they just kind of are recluse, and we have a fair bit of recluse people by nature, right? Like a lot of us were IRC creatures in the 90s and early 2000s, and these bar meetups and things like that were ways that we could kind of escape that. But some people, that just was never their thing, right? And it's like coming out more and more how that might be pretty detrimental to your health, right? I think especially for men of like our age, general age group, right? That like you've mentioned your friends, I've mentioned my friends on this. A lot of men our age don't have any friends, right? Maybe maybe their spouse has some friends, maybe they have some coworkers, but they don't really have friends, right? And so yeah, this is just stuff that I want to like. I just keep wanting to talk about this stuff publicly, and also selfishly, the more publicly I talk about stuff, the more of my friends I get to like interact with, and the less lonely I get to feel in a lot of these feelings and topics and things like that, right? So it's like battling my own version and battle against the loneliness epidemic, but also just making awareness about that public. I think that, I mean, the data is nuts of like, it's worse to be like alone however much of the time than it is to like smoke a pack a day. Like you're more likely to for any cause mortality, you're more likely to die like of like complications from like just being super alone than you are from smoking or diabetes or any of these other causes. It's the data is nuts right now. So that was just something else I wanted to make sure that to talk about.
Yeah, I think that's important too because there's a few people I can think of that I'm not going to name, but folks I've known for 15 or 20 years in this community who I absolutely love and consider super close friends who I only found out during the pandemic were introverts. Like I would see them say 4 or 5 times a year at conferences or whatever. We hang out all the time. We're great friends. I know their kids, I know their spouses, whatever it is. And then like during quarantine, they're like, "This is my Super Bowl. I love this. I don't have to talk to people." I'm like, "Wait
Yeah,
a second,
I see you
what?"
everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, I love you. I see you and hug you. And they're like, "Oh no, I'm an introvert. Like I don't want to talk to people. I just like seeing you and other people like a few times a year, and that's it. Then I'm out."
I'm like an introvert that's good at being an extrovert, right? Like I'm good. I'm like good at social situations, but
Yeah,
I need to recharge my battery. And so I've always debated like, do I want to live urban and visit like rural or vice versa? Because I'm really into the outdoors and camping and hiking and all this kind of stuff. And so I've always had this like call to like live more rural as like a New York City boy growing up. I've never
yeah,
even like thought of it, but
yeah,
COVID kind of forced me to do it for a little while. Long story, but I wound up living a little bit more rural for a bit, and then came back to Austin, and I live pretty close to downtown in Austin, and it just made me realize, however introverted I think I am, just like having the option to like bounce off of people throughout the week is just so valuable to my mental health
yeah.
versus like me and my computer in in the
In the
mountains
basement. Yeah,
somewhere, right, is not the same. Even though I talk to people all day on the internet or whatever, or on Zoom or whatever, it's not the same as like the energy I get by being in downtown Austin and like bouncing off of people and like going to get lunch, going to get coffee, whatever it is. And then I can come back to my hole in my safe zone and like recharge my batteries. But like when you just take that option away, it's pretty rough for me. Some people, love that lifestyle and then like can visit the city. And I've always debated it on and off, but I'm just sharing my personal experience here that it's just been so great to like be back in person, like kind of in this quote unquote post COVID world. I know we're not quite
yeah,
post COVID, but like, somewhat back to normal. It's been great to like bounce off and vibe with people again.
yeah. I think I'm kind of the opposite. I'm like an extreme extrovert who loves to just talk to people. And like,
Yeah.
I've worked from home for 15 years,
Yeah.
so you know,
Yeah.
once or twice a week, and I have to come out of the basement and like go have lunch with somebody
Yeah.
in my little town. Be like, okay, I got to see people.
Yeah.
I haven't worked in an office full time since like 2005 or something. It's been forever.
Yeah, I've made some local friends that I try to like everyone like put it on the calendar. Like we're going to get coffee or lunch at least once a
Yeah,
week, just so I'm not this Zoom creature, right? Like I also like I had a home gym. I joined a public gym. I was like, this is so much better for me to like get out every morning, see the sun in person,
yes.
and like go exercise at a gym. Again, my personal experience and my mental health, but what's worked for me. It's just like, yeah, it's been so nice to kind of be back in a vibrant, like growing city again. So,
Well, I think that's the important thing you just mentioned, Matt, is like finding out what works for you. It's,
mm-hmm,
what works for you isn't going to work for me
mm-hmm,
necessarily, or vice versa.
yep,
Like you have to figure out what your path is, as you said, and, what works for you, and then sort of go from there. We're all making it up.
yeah,
Keep
and,
going
and
on.
I mean, our careers are, like you said, pretty lonely by day. So we got to go seek that
Yeah.
out elsewhere. Like we have a lot of friends in sales that live in planes and live in meetings and live at lunches and live at dinners, and like they probably can't wait to get back to whatever it is that they are not doing that all the time. And I feel like that would be me as well if I was traveling and meeting with people all the time. I would probably, yeah, maybe home base isn't this, because my default is this. Like you're looking at it, like you're looking
Yep.
at
Same.
like many hours a week is my default. So I have to actively seek bouncing into other people. Um, but man, like the opportunities, like going back to like the newsletter, the podcast, the being in real life, the opportunities that like come from this kind of stuff, putting myself out there, right? Like so many doors get opened, right? I've been contacted via the newsletter to help some startups with some content creation that
Mhm.
hey, we don't have anyone that can write and like knows about security, right? Oh, okay, cool. I didn't know that that was a need, and so I'm helping
It's a
some
need.
folks with that. Yeah, of course,
Yes.
you knew it was a need. You're a writer. I'm a security guy. And so, but like, I mean, and then even in person, like, you never know who you're gonna like bounce off. I've just
Exactly.
randomly met a few people that are now like really close friends. Like, I mean, my daughter calls one of our closest friends Auntie Car Wash because we met her at a car wash, like literally, like, and so she was in our phone as Jessica Car Wash, because we didn't even know her last name, and so she's
Just
Auntie
like
Car Wash. Yeah, 6 years, 7 years later, whatever it is, 8 years later, one of
Jessica
our
Carwash.
one of our closest friends. You know, when you meet people, you sometimes you just put like,
Yeah. Yes.
yeah, Dennis RSA, like whatever,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? But yeah, like the you just don't get that if you don't go out there and bounce into people. So
It's very true. It's
yeah,
very true. All right, buddy. Well, this has been awesome, taking up a lot of your time, but
no,
it's
this
so
is
great
great.
to see you. It's awesome
Yeah,
to talk to you. Really excited for what you're doing. You should be very proud of it. It's not easy, and you're doing a great job, man. Everybody, go subscribe to Matt's newsletter. I'll put it in the show notes in the video and in the podcast. You guys can hit that link and
cool.
go give Matt some love.
Yeah, it should be on all podcast platforms soon. I'm definitely on Spotify and Google already. Apple takes a while to get approved, but
It
and
does.
then yeah,
Yes.
YouTube. I'm on YouTube as well. So yeah, I appreciate you linking in the show notes, and I'm gonna do the same. I'm putting your show in my newsletter this week, obviously. So
Sweet.
yeah, appreciate it.
All right, buddy. Great to see you, man.
Yeah,
Take care
thanks so
now.
much.
You got it. See ya.